Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 23, Victory. The fighting men shall from the sun take warmth and life from the growing earth, speed with the light-foot wind to run, and with the trees to never birth, and find when fighting shall be done, great rest and fullness after dearth. The thundering line of battle stands, and in the air death moans and sings, but day shall clasp him with strong hands, and night shall fold him in soft wings. By Julian Grenfell, Flanders, April 1915. The war now entered upon its final phase. During the year 1918, the effort of Britain and of the British Empire reached its highest pitch. The imperial forces in the field against the enemy in all theatres amounted to 4.5 million men, and those under arms to nearly 6 millions. The strength of the Grand Fleet in vessels of every kind reached its maximum, and the Germans were no longer in a condition even to put to sea. The U-boat warfare was defeated and kept down by the operations of nearly 4,000 armed vessels flying the white ensign. Under the protection of these agencies, upwards of 2 million United States troops were transported across the Atlantic, of which more than half were carried in British ships, and landed in France during the year with hardly any loss of life by enemy action. The British mercantile marine of 20,000 vessels maintained the supply of all the British armies and carried without appreciable hindrance all the food and materials needed for the life of the British islands, for their war industries, and for any commerce not required for war production. The control of the seas against the enemy in every quarter of the globe was absolute, and this result was obtained by the employment in the fighting fleets and flotillas, in the mercantile marine, in the naval arsenals and dockyards, and in the shipbuilding yards of over 1,200,000 men. The British munition plants, absorbing the labors of nearly 2.5 million persons, produced all the shell and artillery that the British armies could use, together with every other requisite in increasing abundance. In addition, Britain furnished steel, coal, and other war materials in immense quantities to France and Italy, and was preparing, without prejudice to any other obligation, to supply the United States with the whole of the medium artillery required for an army of 80 divisions for a campaign in 1919. All the preparations had been made, and the process was far advanced of fitting the British armies with technical equipment of every kind for 1919 on a scale in quality and in novelty far superior to any outputs yet achieved. In all there were actually employed under the Crown in the armies, in the fleets, and in the war factories, excluding those engaged in the production of food, coal, and civil necessaries, nearly 8 million men and 750,000 women. The financial measures needed to develop and sustain this prodigious manifestation had required in 1918 alone over 3,000 million pounds sterling, of which 1,000 millions were raised by the taxation of 45 million persons in the British Isles, and 1,600 millions were borrowed at home from the same persons, and 400 millions borrowed abroad, mainly from the United States, on the credit of the British government. But it is with the final effort of the British Army that this chapter is chiefly concerned. From the opening of the campaign of 1918 on March 21 down to the armistice on November 11, the British armies in France suffered 830,000 casualties, and inflicted on the Germans in killed, wounded, and prisoners a comparable loss of 805,000 men. During the same period, the French and Belgians sustained 964,000 casualties and inflicted 660,000 upon the enemy. Up to July, when the tide began definitely to turn, the British armies had already lost during the year, chiefly in bearing the brunt of the German attack, over 400,000 men. In spite of this loss, they were almost continuously engaged in full battle and took from that time onwards at least as many prisoners and guns from the Germans as all the other Allied forces on the Western Front put together. Footnote: the above figures do not include the supplementary German casualties set forth in the tables in Chapter 2 and in Appendix J. Note by the reader, not included here. End of note, end of footnote. At the same time, Great Britain provided the second largest Allied army in the Balkans and terminated the enemy's resistance in German East Africa. Finally, Great Britain and India bore unaided the whole burden of the war against the Turkish Empire, and with an army of over 400,000 men in Mesopotamia and nearly 300,000 men in Palestine, shattered or destroyed 3/4 of the whole remaining Turkish forces and conquered all the regions and provinces in which the operations took place. Such was the culminating war effort of a state which, before the campaign of 1918 began, had already been at war for 3.5 years, suffered more than 1.75 million casualties, sustained a loss of over 6.5 million tons of shipping, and expended 6,000 millions sterling. These facts and figures will excite the wonder of future generations. The first stage of the great advance may be said to have closed on September 3. But once the general success of the Battle of Bapaume was assured, new and even wider combinations were open to Marshal Foch. Of the original projects of biting off the 3 German salients, Amiens, Château-Thierry, and Saint-Mihiel, and freeing the important lateral railway behind them, the 2 first and greatest were already accomplished, and the American enterprise against the third, Saint-Mihiel, was mounted and imminent. These great local operations, which at one time had seemed sufficient for the year, could now be followed by a deliberately conceived combined attempt, involving all the Allied forces, to break up the German front and drive their armies out of France before the winter. It is now necessary to take a parting glance at the structure of railways on which the German armies in France had depended during the 4 years of the war. The taproot of their supplies was the main trunk railway, from the munition factories of Westphalia through Cologne, Liège, Namur, and Maubeuge. Through Maubeuge ran a crescent-shaped T. The great lateral line on which the invading front was built, that is, the railway from Germany through Metz, Messières, Hirson, Maubeuge, Mons, Ghent, and Bruges. From this railway there branched southward and westward all the lines which, with various subsidiary laterals, fed the German armies spread fanwise towards Calais, Amiens, and Paris. Behind the southern portion lay the rugged forest region of the Ardennes, comparatively roadless and railless, and an impassable barrier to the organized retreat of huge modern armies. The German army in France was therefore strategically, to a large extent, formed to a flank along their main lateral communications. If these were broken or they were driven beyond them, the bulk would never get away. Further, nearly 3/4 of the whole German strength radiated from the lateral arc Messières, Hirson, Aulnoy, Mons. The railway junctions of Messières and Aulnoy, near the lost French fortress and railway centre of Maubeuge, were therefore vital organs of the enemy. If these junctions could be captured or paralyzed, the immense mass of invaders depending on them or on the lateral line between them would be cut off. Hitherto the Germans had not been in any strategic anxiety. The front with its successive systems of defense stood, except before Verdun, 50 miles ahead of the lateral line. But now the front was bending and recoiling fast, and the margin of safety space narrowed day by day. Lastly, it must be remembered that all the traffic from the Flanders front, from the Arras front, from the Somme and the Aisne front, as well as the bulk of that from the Argonne, passed in the end through Liège. This bottleneck was too small to cope with the deluge of retreating stores and munitions, and at the same time to supply the imperative to and fro needs of the armies when all were continually in heavy battle. These considerations dictated the movements of the Allies. It was obvious that, apart from Verdun, barred by its inferior communications, the nearest point at which the most deadly blow could be delivered upon the enemy was the junction of Aulnoy near Maubeuge. A British advance against the enemy's front, Cambrai-Saint-Quentin, in the direction of Maubeuge, would, if successful, compromise and compel the early retreat of all the hostile armies deployed with the Ardennes at their back between Maubeuge and Verdun. This, from the moment when these possibilities came into the practical sphere, was the goal of Sir Douglas Haig. Marshal Foch, independently from his higher standpoint, held of course the same view, and it fell to him to concert the whole immense operation. He had, however, at General Pershing's desire, lent himself reluctantly to an American advance upon Metz and into the Saar Valley, if the Saint-Mihiel attack succeeded. This was an irrelevant and divergent feature. If the British army was to undertake the tremendous task of smashing through the Hindenburg line and advancing upon Maubeuge, it was imperative that all other operations should aim at the vital point and contribute to the supreme result. Haig, therefore, at the end of August urged Foch to alter the American offensive from a divergent to a convergent direction, that is, from east to northwest, and towards Mézières, instead of towards Metz. Foch entirely agreed, and after further conferences with Pershing, obtained his assent to the change of plan. On September 3, Marshal Foch's directive prescribed that, while 1. The British armies, supported by the left of the French armies, continue to attack in the general direction Cambrai-Saint-Quentin, and 2. The center of the French armies continues its action to drive the enemy beyond the Aisne and the Ailette. 3. The American army, after delivering at the latest by September 10 their attack on the Saint-Mihiel salient, should prepare as strong and violent an offensive as possible in the general direction of Mézières, covered on the east by the Meuse and supported on the left by the attack of the 4th French Army, Gouraud. In addition to this, by a note of September 8, Foch prescribed a third offensive in Belgium in the general direction of Ghent. A new army group was to be formed comprising the British Second Army, now again under Plumer, the Belgian Army and a French contingent, in all 16 infantry and 7 cavalry divisions. These forces were placed under the command of the King of the Belgians, with the French General Desgouttes as chief of the staff. The attack was in principle a left-handed scoop, pivoting on the British troops holding the Luce near Armentières. Such was the gigantic triple offensive of the Allies: towards Mézières by the French and Americans, towards Maubeuge by the British, and towards Ghent by the Belgians and British with a French contingent. The time was fixed for the end of September. The interval was filled by the forward movement of the Allied armies towards the new main fronts of assault. This involved important preliminary battles. Of these, the first and most famous was the attack by the 1st American Army on the Saint-Mihiel salient. On the morning of September 11, 9 United States divisions, each equal in infantry numbers to 2.5 French or British divisions, and 3 French divisions, broke into the Saint-Mihiel salient. The German and Austrian defenders, who had already been ordered to evacuate, were caught in the early stages of that operation. The Americans, attacking with the utmost ardor, penetrated at the first shock of their eastern attack nearly 6 miles upon a front of 11. On the 12th, they joined hands across the salient with their western attack, and by the 14th, when the operation was completed, had captured 16,000 prisoners and 450 guns. On September 18, the 4th and 3rd British Armies attacked on a 17-mile front centering on Épinay, with the object of bringing the main forces into striking distance of the Hindenburg Line. This preparatory battle was most severe. The British advanced about 3 miles and captured 12,000 prisoners and 100 guns, but with heavy loss. Meanwhile, the French armies slanting back from the British right had, on the night of the 8th, surprised the crossings of the Creusot Canal, and by continual fighting emphasized and exploited the German retreat. The maps, on pages 394 and 95, which was given to me by Sir Douglas Haig, shows the position of all the troops on the Western Front on the eve of its largest battle. Colonel Boriston discharges a necessary task when he sets forth the respective forces on the 3 fronts of the assault. The facts which follow are based on his account, independently checked. For the southern battle there were assembled 31 French and 13 United States divisions, the latter equal in rifle strength to at least 30 French divisions, a total comparable mass of above 60 Allied divisions. To this the enemy opposed 1 Austrian and 19 German divisions, of which 6 were first-class troops. For the northern battle, the Allies had gathered 8 Belgian, 5 British and 3 French infantry divisions, with 1 Belgian, 3 British and 3 French cavalry divisions. Against this army stood 12 German divisions, 4 of good quality. But in the central battle, the Germans were actually superior in numbers to the British. No less than 57 German divisions, 18 of which were assault divisions, were concentrated in the battle area behind the far-famed defenses of the Hindenburg Line. To storm these fortifications and to defeat the German masses upon its front, Sir Douglas Haig could marshal no more than 40 British divisions and the 2nd American Corps. Moreover, the interposition of the Canal du Nord and the Scheldt Canal deprived the British attack almost entirely of the aid of tanks. Each of these episodes would make a thrilling monograph, but these pages can only record in a few sentences the outstanding results. Pershing and Gouraud fell on shoulder to shoulder at daybreak on the 26th, the Americans engaging on a 20, the French on a 24-mile front. The Americans, undaunted by severe losses, stormed the German first system of defenses on almost the whole front of attack, and penetrated at some points nearly 6 3/4 miles. Gouraud's army also advanced from 1 1/4 to 2 1/4 miles. But thereafter neither attack made much progress. The American supply arrangements broke down, the roads became hopelessly blocked for tens of miles with stationary vehicles. The nourishment of the American fighting line with food, ammunition and reinforcements was only achieved partially and with extreme difficulty. The German counterattacks retrieved some of the lost ground, and in places cut off or destroyed the American units which had advanced the farthest. The ground was difficult in the extreme, and a weltering deadlock supervened for several weeks. During this time, however, the French and Americans captured 39,000 prisoners and 300 guns, and held the outnumbered German forces stoutly in their grip. The northern battle was victorious. The Germans, overmatched, fell back before the assault. The British and Belgian divisions fought their way forward through the awful desolation of the Ypres-Passchendaele battlefield, and in 3 days stood on the Ménil-Roulers road 10 miles from their starting point, having captured with small losses nearly 11,000 prisoners and 300 guns. The French contingent was not at this stage engaged. The centre battle had begun on the 27th, on which day the extraordinary obstacle of the Canal du Nord, with its cutting, often 60 feet deep, was stormed by the right of the First Army, Horn, and the left of the Third, Byng. Upon a 13-mile front, a 4-mile advance was achieved with a capture of 10,000 prisoners and 200 guns. This enabled the rest of the Third Army and the Fourth Army, Rawlinson, to come into action to the southward. Rawlinson's artillery, in the absence of tanks in large numbers, had on this occasion subjected the Hindenburg positions to 48 hours intense bombardment in the old style. Nevertheless, when his army attacked on the 29th, it encountered a most severe resistance. The American Corps led the center of the assault. They were supported and were to be leapfrogged by the Australians. A noble rivalry, carried by the Americans to an utter disregard of losses, prevailed between these proud soldiers, sprung from the same stock, speaking the same language, yet drawn from far distant quarters of the globe and by different paths of history. Several strong posts in advance of the German front had not, as was intended, been reduced on the previous day, and moreover both American divisions started 1,000 yards behind their barrage. Over a part of the attack, their dead lay in orderly lines, mowed down by machine gun fire. Elsewhere, their extraordinary ardor carried them deep into the German defenses. The great tunnel through which the canal passed and the deep dugouts of the long-prepared fortifications disgorged strong German forces who took the ambitious assailants in rear and cut off and slew large numbers. But all fought desperately without thought of retirement. The war-experienced Australians advanced in succor, and after further close and bloody fighting, all the ground was gripped and held. This tragic, glorious episode was only a part of the Fourth Army battle, and all three British armies were fully and continuously engaged. By the night of the 30th, the Hindenburg line, on a front of 25 miles, was blasted and pierced to an average depth of 7 miles, and 36,500 prisoners and 380 guns were reported to Sir Douglas Haig. The total British casualties in France from the beginning of September to October 9 were over 200,000, of which 6,500 officers and 133,700 men fell in the series of battles for the Hindenburg Line, otherwise called Cambrai-Saint-Quentin. To these must be added 6,000 Americans, or a fifth of the infantry of the United States Second Army Corps. The battle and advance were continued from the 8th to the 10th of October, 20 kilometers being gained by the latter date on the whole Cambrai-Saint-Quentin front, and 12,000 more prisoners and 230 guns being captured. Under the impulsion of this tremendous central thrust and of the northern and southern battles, the Germans withdrew their forces in all the intervening sectors of the front. They were followed in the closest contact by all the opposing Allied troops. Yet it was only indirectly from the tremendous collisions in the west that the final blow to German resisting power came. The theater where the war had languished in a costly and futile fashion since the summer of 1915, the theater in which exertions were universally condemned by all the highest military authorities of the Allies, was destined to produce the culminating decision. The strength of a chain, however ponderous, is that of its weakest link. The Bulgarian link was about to snap, and with it the remaining cohesion of the whole hostile coalition. This event was not, however, induced by local circumstances. It resulted from the consternation which followed the defeat of the German armies in France. On September 15, agreeably with the general forward movement of the Allies on all the fronts, the so-called Salonika army developed an offensive against Bulgaria. Having for its central objective the important town and railway junction of Uskup. It was indeed a heterogeneous army that advanced under the orders of Franchet d'Esprit. the ultimate successor of Sarai. 8 French, 7 British, 6 Greek, Venizelist, 6 Serbian and 4 Italian divisions, all under strength, wasted with fever and modestly equipped with artillery, set themselves in motion against the mountainous frontiers of Bulgaria. 17 Bulgarian and 2 Turkish divisions, gripped and guided by a few German battalions and batteries, and the prestige of Mackensen, constituted a force ample for a successful defense of such difficult country. But the Bulgarians would fight no more. Bulgaria quitted the field as sullenly, as callously, and as decidedly as she had entered it. The accession of the tepid Malinov ministry to power in the last week of June had caused anxiety in Berlin, and had afforded to the diplomacy of the Allies a fertile opportunity. In particular, the influence of the United States, who had never declared war against Bulgaria and whose representative was still in Sofia, was exerted with potent skill. After weak resistance, which nevertheless revealed the advantages of the defenders, the Bulgarian soldiers retreated, ceased to fight, and declared their intention of going to their homes to gather the harvest. These sturdy peasants were deaf to German expostulations. They were quite friendly to the small German forces which steadily advanced to sustain the front. The retreating battalions even spared the time to help the German cannon out of the ruts. But turn or stand or fight, all that was over forever. On the night of September 26, a Bulgarian staff officer carried a flag of truce to General Milne's headquarters, and in the name of his commander-in-chief sought a 48-hour suspension of hostilities, to be followed by a peace delegation. On the 28th, Bulgaria agreed unconditionally to demobilize her army, to restore all conquered territory, to surrender all means of transport, to cease to be a belligerent, and to place her railways and her territory at the disposal of the Allies for their further operations. I was in Paris with Loucheur when the news arrived, and it was recognized at once that the end had come. On September 29, a conference convened at Spa on Ludendorff's initiative decided to approach President Wilson, whose high ideals fostered hope, with proposals on behalf of Germany for an armistice. On October 1, Hindenburg, under the pressure of the Triple Battle, demanded that the request for an armistice should be made by the next morning. On October 4, King Ferdinand abdicated the Bulgarian crown and fled to Vienna. This extraordinary figure, who combined the extremes of craft, fierceness, resolution, and miscalculation, now vanished from view. It had been twice in his power to achieve a large part of those overweening ambitions of his country which he so ardently championed. Alike after the First Balkan War against Turkey in 1912, or before Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in 1915, he could, by taking a different and easier course, have raised his country to the headship of a Balkan confederation. But the erroneous valuations on which the power and logic of his mind based itself, in complete exclusion of moral factors, forced him at immense personal risk and toil to thrust his country twice over into utter disaster. Those who choose the moment for beginning wars do not always fix the moment for ending them. To ask for an armistice is one thing, to obtain it is another. The new Chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, sent his note to President Wilson on the 5th. He based himself on the 14 points which, in the name of Germany, he accepted. The President replied on the 8th, asking questions and demanding a German withdrawal from invaded territory as a guarantee of good faith. On the 12th, Germany and Austria declared themselves willing to evacuate all invaded territory as a preliminary to an armistice. On the 14th, the President indicated that there could be no negotiation with the Emperor. As for an armistice, the conditions must be left to the commanders in the field, but absolute safeguards must be provided for the maintenance of the present military supremacy of the armies of the United States and of the Allies in the field. During this correspondence, which Mr. Wilson was peculiarly fitted to conduct, and which promised to be lengthy, the Allied armies rolled forward, all along the line in France, maintaining a ceaseless battle at an ever more powerful crescendo of attack. The vital German lateral railway still worked in front of the Ardennes. Pershing and Gouraud were steadily approaching it in the south, and Haig's heavy artillery already held Aulnoy Junction under continual fire. On the northern flank, King Albert's army advanced upon Courtrai. The German troops, in the wide intervals between these main thrusts, fell back continually in conformity with battle results. Ludendorff's reserves were exhausted. A large proportion of his divisions could not be relied upon to fight with determination. All were reduced to a third or fifth of their fighting strength. The Siegfried Line collapsed at many points. Feverish exertions were made to fortify the Antwerp-Meuse positions, and Ludendorff, with true instinct but tardy decision, began to survey a line along the German frontier. Desperate, agitated councils were held between the military leaders and the new political figures who had appeared. On the 20th, the German government renounced the submarine campaign. Meanwhile, in Italy, the whole of the Italian army with their allies, Lord Kevin's British army in the van, hurled themselves across the Piave upon the forces of the liquefying Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in the last week of October completely shattered their military value. The Vatican stretched out an appealing hand. On November 4, an armistice, which deprived the Empire of the Habsburgs of every means of resistance and placed her territories at the disposal of the Allies for further operations, brought hostilities in this theatre to an end. The British armies had now passed the Selle River, taking in the process 21,000 prisoners and 450 guns, and were marching swiftly forward on Valenciennes, Mons, and Maubeuge, driving the enemy before them. The ardor of the troops knew no bounds. The conviction that the terrible enemy they had fought so long was breaking up under their hammer blows, and the rapture and joy of the liberated populations made them more ready to sacrifice their lives in these last days than even in the darkest periods of the war. Every soldier felt himself at once a conqueror and a deliverer. The same impulses inflamed the Americans. As for the French, who shall describe the emotions with which, haggard and torn, but regardless of a loss which in these last months, July to November, exceeded 500,000 men, day by day battered down their ancient foe, and redeemed the sacred soil of France? The armistice for which Hindenburg and Ludendorff had argued wore by now the aspect of an unconditional surrender. Ludendorff thereupon wished to fight on, declaring with truth that nothing could worsen the terms which Germany would receive. On the 27th, the German government, being resolved on total submission, moved the emperor to dismiss him from his post. Hindenburg remained greatly falling with a falling state. To him and to the German machine gunners belong the honors of the final agony. When the great organizations of this world are strained beyond breaking point, their structure often collapses at all points simultaneously. There is nothing on which policy, however wise, can build. No foothold can be found for virtue or valor, no authority or impetus for a rescuing genius. The mighty framework of German imperial power, which a few days before had overshadowed the nations, shivered suddenly into 1,000 individually disintegrating fragments. All her allies, whom she had so long sustained, fell down, broken and ruined, begging separately for peace. The faithful armies were beaten at the front and demoralized from the rear. The proud, efficient navy mutinied. Revolution exploded in the most disciplined and docile of states. The supreme warlord fled. Such a spectacle appalls mankind, and a knell rang in the ear of the victors, even in their hour of triumph. Parliament was disposed to be suspicious of the armistice terms until they heard them. But when the document was read, overwhelming thankfulness filled all hearts. No one could think of any further stipulation. Immediate evacuation of invaded countries, repatriation of all inhabitants, surrender in good condition of 5,000 guns, 30,000 machine guns, 3,000 Minenwerfers, 2,000 aeroplanes, evacuation of the left bank of the Rhine, surrender of 3 bridgeheads on the Rhine, surrender of 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 wagons, 5,000 motor lorries in good working order and with spare parts, disclosure of all mines, of delay action fuses, and assistance of their discovery and destruction, immediate repatriation without reciprocity of all prisoners of war, abandonment of the treaties of Bucharest and Brest-Litovsk, surrender of 6 battle cruisers, the best 10 battleships, 8 light cruisers, 50 of the best destroyers, surrender of all submarines, the right of the Allies on failure of execution of any condition to denounce the armistice within 48 hours. Such were the covenanted clauses. And thus did Germany hand herself over powerless and defenseless to the discretion of her long-tortured and now victorious foes. It was a few minutes before the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. I stood at the window of my room looking up Northumberland Avenue towards Trafalgar Square, waiting for Big Ben to tell that the war was over. My mind strayed back across the scarring years to the scene and emotions of the night at the Admiralty when I listened for these same chimes in order to give the signal of war against Germany to our fleets and squadrons across the world. And now all was over. The unarmed and untrained island nation, who with no defense but its navy had faced unquestioningly the strongest manifestation of military power in human record, had completed its task. Our country had emerged from the ordeal alive and safe, its vast possessions intact, its war effort still waxing, its institutions unshaken, its people and empire united as never before. Victory had come after all the hazards and heartbreaks in an absolute and unlimited form. All the kings and emperors with whom we had warred were in flight or exile. All their armies and fleets were destroyed or subdued. In this Britain had borne a notable part and done her best from first to last. The minutes passed. I was conscious of reaction rather than elation. The material purposes on which one's work had been centered, every process of thought on which one had lived, crumbled into nothing. The whole vast business of supply, the growing outputs, the careful hoards, the secret future plans, but yesterday the whole duty of life, all at a stroke vanished like a nightmare dream, leaving a void behind. My mind mechanically persisted in exploring the problems of demobilization. What was to happen to our 3 million munitions workers? What would they make now? How would the roaring factories be converted? How, in fact, are swords beaten into plowshares? How long would it take to bring the armies home? What would they do when they got home? We had, of course, a demobilization plan for the Ministry of Munitions. It had been carefully worked out, but it had played no part in our thoughts. Now it must be put into operation. The levers must be pulled. Full steam astern. The Munitions Council must meet without delay. And then suddenly the first stroke of the chime. I looked again at the broad street beneath me. It was deserted. From the portals of one of the large hotels absorbed by government departments darted the slight figure of a girl clerk, distractedly gesticulating while another stroke resounded. Then from all sides men and women came scurrying into the street. Streams of people poured out of all the buildings. The bells of London began to clash. Northumberland Avenue was now crowded with people in hundreds, nay, thousands, rushing hither and thither in a frantic manner, shouting and screaming with joy. I could see that Trafalgar Square was already swarming. Around me in our very headquarters, in the Hotel Metropole, disorder had broken out. Doors banged, feet clattered down corridors. Everyone rose from the desk and cast aside pen and paper. All bounds were broken. The tumult grew. It grew like a gale, but from all sides simultaneously. The street was now a seething mass of humanity. Flags appeared as if by magic. Streams of men and women flowed from the embankment. They mingled with torrents pouring down the Strand on their way to acclaim the king. Almost before the last stroke of the clock had died away, the strict, war-strained, regulated street of London had become a triumphant pandemonium. At any rate, it was clear that no more work would be done that day. Yes, the chains which had held the world were broken. Links of imperative need, links of discipline, links of brute force, links of self-sacrifice, links of terror, links of honor which held our nation, nay, the greater part of mankind, to grinding toil, to a compulsive course. Every one had snapped upon a few strokes of the clock. Safety, freedom, peace, home, the dear one back at the fireside. All after 52 months of gaunt distortion. After 52 months of making burdens grievous to be borne and binding them on man's back, at last, all at once, suddenly and everywhere, the burdens were cast down. At least so for the moment it seemed. My wife arrived, and we decided to go and offer our congratulations to the Prime Minister, on whom the central impact of the home struggle had fallen, in his hour of recompense. But no sooner had we entered our car than 20 people mounted upon it, and in the middle of a wildly cheering multitude we were impelled slowly forward through Whitehall. We had driven together the opposite way along the same road on the afternoon of the ultimatum. There had been the same crowd and almost the same enthusiasm. It was with feelings which do not lend themselves to words that I heard the cheers of the brave people who had borne so much and given all, who had never wavered, who had never lost faith in their country or its destiny, and who could be indulgent to the faults of their servants when the hour of deliverance had come. It will certainly not fall to this generation to pronounce the final verdict upon the Great War. The German people are worthy of better explanations than the shallow tale that they were undermined by enemy propaganda. If the propaganda was effective, it was because it awoke an echo in German hearts and stirred misgivings which from the beginning had dwelt there. Thus, when 4 years of blockade and battle against superior numbers and resources had sapped the vitality of the German people, the rebellious whispers of conscience became the proclaimed opinion of millions. Yet, in the sphere of force, human records contain no manifestation like the eruptions of the German volcano. For 4 years Germany fought and defied the 5 continents of the world by land and sea and air. The German armies upheld her tottering confederates, intervened in every theater with success, stood everywhere on conquered territory, and inflicted on their enemies more than twice the bloodshed they suffered themselves. To break their strength and science and curb their fury, it was necessary to bring all the greatest nations of mankind into the field against them. Overwhelming populations, unlimited resources, measureless sacrifice, the sea blockade, could not prevail for 50 months. Small states were trampled down in the struggle, a mighty empire was battered into unrecognizable fragments, and nearly 20 million men perished or shed their blood before the sword was wrested from that terrible hand. Surely, Germans, for history, it is enough. The curtain falls upon the long front in France and Flanders. The soothing hands of time and nature, the swift repair of peaceful industry, have already almost effaced the crater fields and the battle lines which, in a broad belt from the Vosges to the sea, lately blackened the smiling fields of France. The ruins are rebuilt. The riven trees are replaced by new plantations. Only the cemeteries, the monuments and stunted steeples, with here and there a mouldering trench or huge mine-crater lake, assail the traveller with the fact that 25 millions of soldiers fought here and 12 millions shed their blood or perished in the greatest of all human contentions some 20 years ago. Merciful oblivion draws its veils. The crippled limp away. The mourners fall back into the sad twilight of memory. New youth is here to claim its right, and the perennial stream flows forward even in the battle zone, as if the tale were all a dream. Is this the end? Is it to be merely a chapter in a cruel and senseless story? Will a new generation in their turn be immolated to square the black accounts of Teuton and Gaul? Will our children bleed and gasp again in devastated lands? Or will there spring from the very fires of conflict that reconciliation of the three giant combatants, which would unite their genius and secure to each in safety and freedom a share in rebuilding the glory of Europe?